I walked around, looking at every detail of the place. I stood in the shade of a big tree a short distance away and peered across a flat strip of land to some cornfields on the side of a hill. Something quite unusual struck me then. The details of the surroundings didn't change or vanish no matter how long I peered at them. I got scared and ran back to where I was sleeping. I was still there, exactly as I had been before. I began to watch myself. I had an eerie feeling of indifference towards the body I was watching. Then I heard the sound of people approaching. People always seemed to be around for me. I ran up ahead to a small hill and carefully watched from there. There were 10 people coming to the field where I was. They were all young men. I ran back to where I was lying and went through one of the most agonizing times of my life while I faced myself lying there snoring like a pig. I knew that I had to awaken me, but I had no idea how. I also knew that it was deadly for me to awaken myself. But if those young men were to find me there, they were going to be very upset. All those deliberations that were going through my mind were not really thoughts. They were more appropriately scenes in front of my eyes. My worrying, for instance, was a scene in which I looked at myself while I had the sensation of being boxed in. I call that worrying. It has happened to me a number of times after that first time. Well, since I didn't know what to do, I stood looking at myself, waiting for the worst. A bunch of fleeting images went past me in front of my eyes. I hung onto one in particular, the sight of my house and my bed. The image became very clear. Oh, how I wished to be back in my bed. Something shook me then. It felt like someone was hitting me, and I woke up. I was on my bed. Obviously, I had been dreaming. I jumped out of bed and ran to the place of my dreaming. It was exactly as I had seen it. The young men were working there. I watched them for a long time. They were the same ones I had seen. I came back to the same place at the end of the day after everybody had gone and stood at the very spot where I had seen myself asleep. Someone had lain there. The weeds were crumpled. Don Juan and Don Genaro were observing me. They looked like two strange animals. I felt a shiver in my back. I was on the verge of indulging in the very rational fear that they were not really men like myself, but Don Genaro laughed. In those days, he said, I was just like you, Carlitos. I wanted to check everything. I was as suspicious as you are. He paused, raised his finger, and shook it at me. Then he faced Don Juan. Weren't you as suspicious as this guy? He asked. Not a chance, Don Juan said. He's the champ. Don Genaro turned to me and made a gesture of apology. I think I was wrong, he said. I was not as suspicious as you. They chuckled softly as if they didn't want to make noise. Don Juan's body convulsed with muffled laughter. This is a place of power for you, Don Genaro said in a whisper. You've written your fingers off, right where you're sitting. Have you ever done some heavy dreaming here? No, he hasn't, Don Juan said in a low voice. But he's done some heavy writing. They doubled up. It seemed that they didn't want to laugh out loud. Their bodies shook. Their soft laughter was like a rhythmical cackle. Don Genaro sat up straight and slid closer to me. He patted me on the shoulder repeatedly, saying that I was a rascal. Then he pulled my left arm with great force towards him. I lost my balance and fell forward. I almost hit my face on the hard ground. I automatically put my right arm in front and buffered my fall. One of them held me down by pressing on my neck. I wasn't sure who. The hand that was holding me felt like Don Genaro's. I had a moment of devastating panic. I felt like I was fainting. Perhaps I did. The pressure in my stomach was so intense that I vomited. My next clear perception was that somebody was helping me to sit up. Don Genaro was squatting in front of me. I turned around to look for Don Juan. He was nowhere in sight. Don Genaro had a beaming smile. His eyes were shiny. They were looking fixedly at mine. I asked him, "What had you done to me?" and he said that I was in pieces. His tone was reproachful, and he seemed to be annoyed or dissatisfied with me. He repeated various times that I was in pieces and that I had to come together again. He tried to feign a severe tone, but he laughed in the middle of his harangue. He was telling me that it was just terrible that I was spread all over the place, and that he would have to use a broom to sweep all my pieces into one heap. Then he added that I might get the pieces in the wrong places and end up with my penis where my thumb should be. He cracked up at that point. I wanted to laugh and had a most unusual sensation. My body fell apart. It was as if I had been a mechanical toy that simply broke up into pieces. I had no physical feelings whatever, and neither had I any fear or concern. Coming apart was a scene that I witnessed from the point of view of the perceiver, and yet I didn't perceive anything from a sensorial point of reference. The next thing I became aware of was that Don Genaro was manipulating my body. I then had a physical sensation, a vibration so intense that it made me lose sight of everything around me. I felt once more that someone was helping me to sit up. I again saw Don Genaro squatting in front of me. He pulled me up by my armpits and helped me walk around. I couldn't figure out where I was. I had the feeling I was in a dream, and yet I had a complete sense of sequential time. I was keenly aware that I had just been with Don Genaro and Don Juan in the ramada of Don Juan's house. Don Genaro walked with me, propping me by holding my left armpit. The scenery I was watching changed constantly. I couldn't determine, however, the nature of what I was observing. What was in front of my eyes was rather like a feeling or a mood, and the center from where all those changes radiated was definitely in my stomach. I had made that connection not as a thought or a realization, but as a bodily sensation that suddenly became fixed and predominant. The fluctuations around me came from my stomach. I was creating a world, an endless run of feelings and images. Everything I knew was there. That, in itself, was a feeling, not a thought or a conscious assessment. I tried to keep tabs for a moment because of my nearly invincible habit of assessing everything, but at a certain instant my processes of bookkeeping ceased, and a nameless something enveloped me, feelings and images of every sort. At one point, something in me began again the tabulation, and I noticed that one image kept on repeating itself. Don Juan and Don Genaro, who were trying to reach me. The image was fleeting. It passed by me fast. It was something comparable to seeing them from the window of a fast-moving vehicle. They seemed to be trying to catch me as I went by. The image became clearer, and it lasted longer as it kept on recurring. I consciously realized at one point that I was deliberately isolating it from among a myriad of other images. I sort of breezed through the rest to come to that particular scene. Finally, I was capable of sustaining it by thinking about it. Once I had begun to think, my ordinary processes took over. They weren't as defined as in my ordinary activities, but clear enough to know that the scene or feeling I had isolated was that Don Juan and Don Genaro were in the ramada of Don Juan's house and were holding me by the armpits. I wanted to keep on fleeing through other images and feelings, but they wouldn't let me. I struggled for a moment. I felt bouncy and happy. I knew that I liked both of them, and I also knew that I wasn't afraid of them. I wanted to joke with them. I didn't know how, and I kept on laughing and patting them on their shoulders. I had another peculiar awareness. I was certain that I was dreaming. If I focused my eyes on anything, it immediately became blurry. Don Juan and Don Genaro were talking to me. I couldn't keep their words straight, and I couldn't distinguish which of them was talking. Don Juan then turned my body around and pointed to a lump on the ground. Don Genaro pulled me closer to it and made me go around it. The lump was a man lying on the ground. He was lying on his stomach, his face turned to his right. They kept on pointing out the man to me as they spoke. They pulled me and twisted me around him. I couldn't focus my eyes on him at all, but finally, I had a feeling of quietness and sobriety, and I looked at the man. I had a slow awakening into the realization that the man lying on the ground was me. My realization didn't bring any terror or discomfort. I simply accepted it, without emotion. At that moment, I wasn't completely asleep, but neither was I completely awake and in sober consciousness. I also became more aware of Don Juan and Don Genaro and could tell them apart when they talked to me. Don Juan said that we were going to go to the round power place in the chaparral. As soon as he said it, the image of the place popped in my mind. I saw the dark masses of bushes around it. I turned to my right. Don Juan and Don Genaro were also there. I had a jolt and the feeling that I was afraid of them. Perhaps because they looked like two menacing shadows. They came closer to me. As soon as I saw their features, my fears vanished. I liked them again. It was as if I were drunk and didn't have a firm grip on anything. They grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me in unison. They ordered me to wake up. I could hear their voices clearly and separately. I had then a unique moment. I held two images in my mind, two dreams. I felt that something in me was deeply asleep and was waking up, and I found myself lying on the floor of the Ramada with Don Juan and Don Genaro shaking me. But I also was at the power place, and Don Juan and Don Genaro were still shaking me. There was one crucial instant in which I was neither in one place nor the other, but I was rather in both places as an observer seeing two scenes at once. I had the incredible sensation that at that instant, I could have gone either way. All I had to do at that moment was to change perspective, and rather than watch either scene from the outside, feel it from the point of view of the subject. There was something very warm about Don Juan's house. I preferred that scene. I next had a terrifying seizure, so shocking that my entire ordinary awareness came back to me at once. Don Juan and Don Genaro were pouring buckets of water on me. I was in the Ramada of Don Juan's house. Hours later, we sat in the kitchen. Don Juan had insisted that I had to proceed as if nothing had happened. He gave me some food and said that I had to eat a great deal to compensate for my expenditure of energy. It was after 9 in the evening when I looked at my watch after we had sat down to eat. My experience had lasted several hours. From the point of view of my recollection, however, it seemed that I had just fallen asleep for a short while. Even though I was completely myself, I still was numb. It wasn't until I had begun to write in my notebook that I regained my usual awareness. It was a surprise to me that taking notes could bring about instantaneous sobriety. The moment I was myself again, a barrage of reasonable thoughts immediately came to my mind. They purported to explain the phenomenon I had experienced. I knew on the spot that Don Genaro had hypnotized me the moment he pinned me down on the ground, but I didn't attempt to figure out how he had done it. They both laughed hysterically when I expressed my thoughts. Don Genaro examined my pencil and said that the pencil was the key to wind up my mainspring. I felt quite belligerent. I was tired and irritable. I found myself practically yelling at them while their bodies shook with laughter. Don Juan said that it was permissible to miss the boat, but not by such a wide margin, and that Don Genaro had come exclusively to help me and show me the mystery of the dreamer and the dreamed. My irritability came to a peak. Don Juan signaled Don Genaro with a movement of his head. Both of them stood and took me around the house. There Don Genaro demonstrated his great repertoire of animal grunts and cries. He asked me to choose one, and he taught me how to reproduce it. After hours of practice, I got to the point where I could imitate it quite well. The end result was that they themselves had enjoyed my clumsy attempts and laughed until they were practically weeping, and I had released my tension by reproducing the loud cry of an animal. I told them that there was something truly awesome in my imitation. The relaxation of my body was unequaled. Don Juan said that if I would perfect the cry, I could turn it into an affair of power, or I could simply use it to relieve my tension whenever I needed to. He suggested I should go to sleep, but I was afraid to fall asleep. I sat with them by the kitchen fire for a while, and then, quite unintentionally, I fell into a deep sleep. I woke up at dawn. Don Genaro was sleeping by the door. He seemingly woke up at the same time I did. They had covered me up and folded my jacket as a pillow. I felt very calm and rested. I commented to Don Genaro that I had felt exhausted the night before. He said that so had he. He whispered, as if he were confiding in me, and told me that Don Juan was even more exhausted because he was older. "You and I are young," he said with a glint in his eyes, "but he's old. He must be about 300 now." I sat up hurriedly. Don Genaro covered his face with his blanket and roared with laughter. Don Juan came into the room at that moment. I had a feeling of completement and peace. For once, nothing really mattered. I was so at ease that I wanted to weep. Don Juan said that the night before I had begun to be aware of my luminosity. He admonished me not to indulge in the sense of well-being I was having because it would turn into complacency. At this moment, I said, I don't want to explain anything. It doesn't matter what Don Genaro did to me last night. "I didn't do anything to you," Don Genaro retorted. "Look, it's me, Genaro, your Genaro. Touch me." I embraced Don Genaro, and we both laughed like two children. He asked me if I thought it was strange that I could embrace him then when last time I had seen him there I had been unable to touch him. I assured him that those issues were no longer pertinent to me. Don Juan's comment was that I was indulging in being broad-minded and good. "Watch out," he said. "A warrior never lets his guard down. If you keep on being so happy, you're going to drain the little power you have left." "What should I do?" I asked. "Be yourself," he said. "Doubt everything. Be suspicious." "But I don't like to be that way, Don Juan." "It's not a matter of whether you like it or not. What matters is, what can you use as a shield? A warrior must use everything available to him to close his mortal gap once it opens. So it's of no importance that you really don't like to be suspicious or ask questions. That's your only shield now. Right. Right, or you'll die. To die with elation is a crappy way of dying." "How should a warrior die, then?" Don Genaro asked, in exactly my own tone of voice. "A warrior dies the hard way," Don Juan said. "His death must struggle to take him. A warrior does not give himself to it. Don Genaro opened his eyes to an enormous size and then blinked. What Genaro showed you yesterday is of utmost importance, Don Juan went on. You can't slough it off with piousness. Yesterday you told me that you had been driven wild with the idea of the double, but look at you now. You don't care anymore. That's the trouble with people that go wild. They go wild both ways. Yesterday you were all questions. Today you are all acceptance. I pointed out that he always found a flaw in what I did, regardless of how I did it. That's not true, he exclaimed. There is no flaw in the warrior's way. Follow it and your acts cannot be criticized by anyone. Take yesterday as an example. The warrior's way would have been first to ask questions without fear and without suspicion, and then let Genaro show you the mystery of the dreamer, without fighting him or draining yourself. Today, the warrior's way would be to assemble what you've learned, without presumptuousness and without piousness. Do that, and no one can find flaws in it. I thought, by his tone, that Don Juan must have been terribly annoyed with my blunderings, but he smiled at me, and then giggled as if his own words had made him laugh. I told him that I was just holding back, not wanting to burden them with my probes. I was, indeed, overwhelmed by what Don Genaro had done. I had been convinced, although it no longer mattered, that Don Genaro had been waiting in the bushes for Don Juan to call him. Then later on, he had cashed in on my fright and used it to stun me. After being held forcibly on the ground, I must have undoubtedly passed out, and then Don Genaro must have mesmerized me. Don Juan argued that I was too strong to be subdued that easily. What took place then? I asked him. Genaro came to see you, to tell you something very exclusive, he said. When he came out of the bushes, he was Genaro the Double. There is another way to talk about this that would explain it better, but I can't use it now. Why not, Don Juan? Because you are not ready yet to talk about the totality of oneself. For the time being, I can only say that this Genaro here is not the Double now. He pointed to Don Genaro with a movement of his head. Don Genaro blinked repeatedly. The Genaro of last night was the Double. And as I told you already, the Double has inconceivable power. He showed you a most important issue. In order to do that, he had to touch you. The Double simply tapped you on the neck, on the same spot the ally walked over you years ago. Naturally, you went out like a light. And naturally, too, you indulged like a son of a bitch. It took us hours to round you up. Thus you dissipated your power, and when the time came for you to accomplish a warrior's feat, you did not have enough sap. What was that warrior's feat, Don Juan? I told you that Genaro came to show you something, the mystery of luminous beings as dreamers. You wanted to know about the Double. It begins in dreams, but then you asked, what is the Double? And I said the Double is the Self. The Self dreams the Double. That should be simple, except that there is nothing simple about us. Perhaps the ordinary dreams of the Self are simple, but that doesn't mean that the Self is simple. Once it has learned to dream the Double, the Self arrives at this weird crossroad, and a moment comes when one realizes that it is the Double who dreams the Self. I had written down everything he had said. I had also paid attention to what he was saying, but had failed to understand him. Don Juan repeated his statements. The lesson last night, as I told you, was about the dreamer and the dreamed, or who dreams whom. I beg your pardon, I said. Both of them broke into laughter. Last night, Don Juan proceeded, you almost chose to wake up at the power place. What do you mean, Don Juan? That would have been the feat. If you had not indulged in your stupid ways, you would have had enough power to tip the scales, and you would have, no doubt, scared yourself to death. Fortunately, or unfortunately, as the case may be, you did not have enough power. In fact, you wasted your power in worthless confusion to the point that you almost didn't have enough to survive. So, as you may very well understand, to indulge in your little quirks is not only stupid and wasteful, but also injurious. A warrior that drains himself cannot live. The body is not an indestructible affair. You might have gotten gravely ill. You didn't, simply because Genaro and I deviated some of your crap. The full impact of his words was beginning to take hold of me. Last night Genaro guided you through the intricacies of the double, Don Juan went on. Only he can do that for you. And it was not a vision or a hallucination when you saw yourself lying on the ground. You could have realized that with infinite clarity if you had not gotten lost in your indulging. And you could have known then that you yourself are a dream. That your double is dreaming you in the same fashion that you dreamed him last night. But how can that be possible, Don Juan? No one knows how it happens. We only know that it does happen. That's the mystery of us as luminous beings. Last night, you had 2 dreams, and you could have awakened in either one, but you didn't have enough power even to understand that. They looked at me fixedly for a moment. I think he understands, Don Genaro said. The Secret of the Luminous Beings. Don Genaro delighted me for hours with some preposterous instructions on how to manage my daily world. Don Juan said that I should be very careful and serious-minded about the recommendations made by Don Genaro because although they were funny, they weren't a joke. Around noon, Don Genaro stood up and without saying a word, walked into the bushes. I was also going to get up, but Don Juan gently held me down, and in a solemn voice announced that Don Genaro was going to try one more thing with me. "What's he up to?" I asked. "What is he going to do to me?" Don Juan assured me that I didn't have to worry. "You are approaching a crossroad," he said. "A certain crossroad that every warrior comes to." I had the idea that he was talking about my death. He seemed to anticipate my question and signaled me not to say anything. "We won't discuss this matter," he said. "Suffice it to say that the crossroad I'm referring to is the sorcerer's explanation. Genaro believes you're ready for it." "When are you going to tell me about it?" "I don't know when. You are the recipient, therefore it is up to you. You will have to decide when." "What's wrong with right now?" "To decide doesn't mean to choose an arbitrary time," he said. "To decide means that you have trimmed your spirit impeccably, and that you have done everything possible to be worthy of knowledge and power. Today, however, you must solve a little riddle for Genaro. He's gone ahead of us, and he'll be waiting somewhere in the chaparral. No one knows the spot where he'll be, or the specific time to go to him. If you're capable of determining the right time to leave the house, you will also be capable of guiding yourself to where he is." I told Don Juan that I couldn't imagine anyone being able to solve such a riddle. "How can leaving the house at a specific time guide me to where Don Genaro is?" I asked. Don Juan smiled and began to hum a tune. He seemed to enjoy my agitation. "That's the problem which Genaro has set up for you," he said. "If you have enough personal power, you will decide with absolute certainty the right time to leave the house. How leaving at the precise time will guide you is something that no one knows, and yet, if you have enough power, you yourself will attest that this is so." "But how am I going to be guided, Don Juan?" "No one knows that either." "I think Don Genaro is pulling my leg." "You better watch out then," he said. If Genaro is pulling your leg, he's liable to yank it out." Don Juan laughed at his own joke. I couldn't join him. My fear about the inherent danger of Don Genaro's manipulations was too real. "Can you give me some clues?" I asked. "There are no clues," he said cuttingly. "Why does Don Genaro want to do this?" "He wants to test you," he replied. "Let's say that it is very important for him to know whether you can take the sorcerer's explanation. If you solve the riddle, the implication will be that you have stored enough personal power and you're ready. But if you flub it, it'll be because you don't have enough power. And in that case, the sorcerer's explanation won't make any sense to you. I think that we should give you the explanation regardless of whether you understand it or not. That's my idea. Genaro is a more conservative warrior. He wants things in their proper order, and he won't give in until he thinks you're ready." "Why don't you just tell me about the sorcerer's explanation yourself?" "Because Genaro must be the one who helps you." "Why is that so, Don Juan?" "Genaro doesn't want me to tell you why," he said. "Not yet." "Would it hurt me to know the sorcerer's explanation?" I asked. "I don't think so." "Please, Don Juan, tell me then." "You must be joking. Genaro has precise ideas on this matter, and we must honor and respect them." He made an imperative gesture to quiet me. After a long, unnerving pause, I ventured a question. "But how can I solve this riddle, Don Juan?" "I really don't know that. Thus, I can't advise you what to do," he said. "Genaro is more efficient. He designed the riddle just for you. Since he's doing this for your benefit, he's attuned to you alone. Therefore, only you can pick the precise time to leave the house. He will call you himself and guide you by means of his call." "What will his call be like?" "I don't know. His call is for you, not for me. He'll be tapping your will directly. In other words, you must use your will in order to know the call. Genaro feels that he must make sure at this point that you have stored sufficient personal power to enable you to turn your will into a functioning unit." Will was another concept which Don Juan had delineated with great care, but without making it clear. I had gathered from his explanations that will was a force that emanated from the umbilical region through an unseen opening below the navel, an opening he had called the gap. Will was allegedly cultivated only by sorcerers. It came to the practitioners veiled in mystery and purportedly gave them the capacity to perform extraordinary acts. I remarked to Don Juan that there was no chance that anything so vague could ever be a functioning unit in my life. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "The will develops in a warrior in spite of every opposition of the reason." "Can't Don Genaro, being a sorcerer, know whether I'm ready or not without testing me?" I asked. "He certainly can," he said. "But that knowledge won't be of any value or consequence because it has nothing to do with you. You are the one who's learning. Therefore, you yourself must claim knowledge as power, not Genaro. Genaro is not concerned with his knowing as much as with your knowing. You must find out whether or not your will works. This is a very difficult point to make. In spite of what Genaro or I know about you, you must prove to yourself that you are in the position to claim knowledge as power. In other words, you yourself have to be convinced that you can exercise your will. If you're not, then you must become convinced today. If you cannot perform this task, then Genaro's conclusion will be that regardless of what he might see about you, you're not ready yet." I experienced an overwhelming apprehension. "Is all this necessary?" I asked. "It's Genaro's request, and it must be obeyed," he said in a firm but friendly tone. But what does Don Genaro have to do with me? You may find that out today, he said, and smiled. I pleaded with Don Juan to get me out of that intolerable situation and explain all the mysterious talk. He laughed and patted my chest and made a joke about a Mexican weightlifter who had enormous pectoral muscles but couldn't do heavy physical labor because his back was weak. Watch those muscles, he said. They shouldn't be just for show. My muscles have nothing to do with what you're talking about, I said, in a belligerent mood. They do, he replied. The body must be perfection before the will is a functioning unit. Don Juan had again deviated the direction of my probing. I felt restless and frustrated. I stood up and went to the kitchen and drank some water. Don Juan followed me and suggested that I should practice the animal cry that Don Genaro had taught me. We walked to the side of the house. I sat on a pile of wood and involved myself in reproducing it. Don Juan made some corrections and gave me some pointers about my breathing. The end result was a state of complete physical relaxation. We returned to the Ramada and sat down again. I told him that sometimes I felt irked with myself because I was so helpless. There is nothing wrong with the feeling of being helpless, he said. All of us are most familiar with it. Remember that we have spent an eternity as helpless infants. I have already told you that at this very moment you are like an infant who can't get out of the crib by himself, much less act on his own. Genaro gets you out of your crib, let's say, by picking you up. But an infant wants to act, and since he can't, he complains. There's nothing wrong with that, but to indulge in protesting and complaining is another matter. He demanded that I keep myself relaxed. He suggested that I ask him questions for a while, until I was in a better frame of mind. For a moment, I was at a loss and couldn't decide what to ask. Don Juan unrolled a straw mat and told me to sit on it. Then he filled a large gourd with water and put it in a carrying net. He seemed to be preparing for a journey. He sat down again and urged me with a movement of his eyebrows to begin my questions. I asked him to tell me more about the moth. He gave me a long, scrutinizing look and chuckled. That was an ally, he said. You know that. But what actually is an ally, Don Juan? There is no way of saying what exactly an ally is, just as there is no way of saying what exactly a tree is. A tree is a living organism, I said. That doesn't tell me much, he said. I can also say that an ally is a force, a tension. I've told you that already, but that doesn't say much about an ally. Just like in the case of a tree, the only way to know what an ally is by experiencing it. Over the years, I have struggled to prepare you for the momentous encounter with an ally. You may not realize this, but it took you years of preparation to meet tree. To meet ally is no different. A teacher must acquaint his disciple with ally, little by little, piece by piece. You have, over the course of the years, stored a great amount of knowledge about it, and now you are capable of putting that knowledge together to experience ally, the way you experience tree. I have no idea that I'm doing that, Don Juan. Your reason is not aware of it, because it cannot accept the possibility of ally to begin with. Fortunately, it is not the reason which puts ally together. It is the body. You have perceived ally in many degrees and on many occasions. Each of those perceptions was stored in your body. The sum of those pieces is the ally. I don't know any other way of describing it. I said that I couldn't conceive that my body was acting by itself as if it were an entity separate from my reason. It isn't, but we have made it so, he said. Our reason is petty, and it is always at odds with our body. This, of course, is only a way of talking, but the triumph of a man of knowledge is that he has joined the two together. Since you're not a man of knowledge, your body does things now that your reason cannot comprehend. The ally is one of those things. You were not mad, neither were you dreaming when you perceived the ally that night, right here. I asked him about the frightening idea which he and Don Genaro had implanted in me that the ally was an entity waiting for me at the edge of a small valley in the mountains of northern Mexico. They had told me that sooner or later I had to keep my appointment with the ally and wrestle with it. Those are ways of talking about mysteries for which there are no words, he said. Genaro and I said that at the edge of that plain the ally was waiting for you. That statement was true, but it doesn't have the meaning that you want to give it. The ally is waiting for you, that's for sure. But it is not at the edge of any plain. It is right here, or there, or in any other place. The ally is waiting for you, just like death is waiting for you, everywhere and nowhere. Why is the ally waiting for me? For the same reason that death waits for you, he said. Because you were born. There is no possibility of explaining at this point what is meant by that. You must first experience the ally. You must perceive it in its full force. Then the sorcerer's explanation may throw light upon it. So far, you've had enough power to clarify at least one point, that the ally is a moth. Some years ago, you and I went to the mountains, and you had a bout with something. I had no way of telling you then what was taking place. You saw a strange shadow flying back and forth in front of the fire. You yourself said that it looked like a moth. Although you didn't know what you were talking about, you were absolutely correct. The shadow was a moth. Then on another occasion, something frightened you out of your wits after you had fallen asleep, again in front of a fire. I had warned you not to fall asleep, but you disregarded my warning. That act left you at the mercy of the ally, and the moth stepped on your neck. Why you survived will always be a mystery to me. You didn't know then, but I had given you up for dead. Your blunder was that serious. From then on, every time we've been in the mountains or in the desert, even if you didn't notice it, the moth always followed us. All in all, then, we can say that for you the ally is a moth, but I cannot say that it is really a moth the way we know moths. Calling the ally a moth is again only a way of talking, a way of making that immensity out there understandable. Is the ally a moth for you too? I asked. No. The way one understands the ally is a personal matter, he said. I mentioned that we were back where we had started. He hadn't told me what an ally really was. There's no need to be confused, he said. Confusion is a mood one enters into, but one can also get out of it. At this point, there's no way of clarifying anything. Perhaps later on today we'll be able to consider these matters in detail. It's up to you. Or rather, it's up to your personal power. He refused to say one more word. I became quite upset with the fear that I was going to fail the test. Don Juan took me to the back of his house and made me sit on a straw mat at the edge of an irrigation ditch. The water moved so slowly that it almost seemed stagnant. He commanded me to sit quietly, shut off my internal dialogue, and look at the water. He said that years before he'd discovered that I had a certain affinity for bodies of water, a feeling that was most convenient for the endeavors I was involved in. I remarked that I was not particularly fond of bodies of water, but neither did I dislike them. He said that that was precisely why water was beneficial for me. I was indifferent towards it. Under conditions of stress, water could not trap me, but neither could it reject me. He sat slightly behind me to my right and admonished me to let go and not be afraid because he was there to help me if there was any need. I had a moment of fear. I looked at him, waiting for further instructions. He forcibly turned my head towards the water and ordered me to proceed. I had no idea what he wanted me to do, so I simply relaxed. As I looked at the water, I caught sight of the reeds on the opposite side. Unconsciously, I rested my unfocused eyes on them. The slow current made them quiver. The water had the color of the desert dirt. I noticed that the ripples around the reeds looked like furrows or crevices on a smooth surface. At one instant, the reeds became gigantic. The water was a smooth, flat ochre surface, and then in a matter of seconds I was sound asleep. Or perhaps I entered into a perceptual state for which I had no parallel. The closest way of describing it would be to say that I went to sleep and had a portentous dream. I felt that I could have gone on with it indefinitely if I had wanted to, but I deliberately ended it by engaging myself in a conscious self-dialogue. I opened my eyes. I was lying on the straw mat. Don Juan was a few feet away. My dream had been so magnificent that I began to recount it to him. He signaled me to be quiet. With a long twig, he pointed to two long shadows that some dry branches of desert chaparral cast on the ground. The tip of his twig followed the outline of one of the shadows as if it were drawing it. Then it jumped to the other and did the same with it. The shadows were about a foot long and over an inch wide. They were from 5 to 6 inches apart from each other. The movement of the twig forced my eyes out of focus, and I found myself looking with crossed eyes at 4 long shadows. Suddenly, the 2 shadows in the middle merged into one and created an extraordinary perception of depth. There was some inexplicable roundness and volume in the shadow thus formed. It was almost like a transparent tube, a round bar of some unknown substance. I knew that my eyes were crossed, and yet they seemed to be focused on one spot. The view there was crystal clear. I could move my eyes without dispelling the image. I continued watching, but without letting my guard down. I experienced a curious compulsion to let go and immerse myself in the scene. Something in what I was observing seemed to pull me, but something in myself surfaced, and I began a semi-conscious dialogue. Almost instantly, I became aware of my surroundings in the world of everyday life. Don Juan was watching me. He appeared to be puzzled. I asked him if there was something wrong. He didn't answer. He helped me to sit up. It was only then that I realized that I had been lying on my back, looking at the sky, and Don Juan had been leaning over my face. My first impulse was to tell him that I had actually seen the shadows on the ground while I had been looking at the sky, but he put his hand over my mouth. We sat in silence for a while. I had no thoughts. I experienced an exquisite sense of peace, and then quite abruptly, I had an unyielding urge to get up and go into the chaparral to look for Don Genaro. I made an attempt to speak to Don Juan. He jutted his chin and twisted his lips as a silent command not to talk. I tried to assess my predicament in a rational manner. I was enjoying my silence so much, however, that I didn't want to bother with logical considerations. After a moment's pause, I again felt the imperious need to walk into the bushes. I followed a trail. Don Juan tagged along behind me, as if I were the leader. We walked for about an hour. I succeeded in remaining without any thoughts. Then we came to a hillside. Don Genaro was there, sitting near the top of a rock wall. He greeted me effusively and had to yell his words. He was about 50 feet above the ground. Don Juan made me sit down and then sat next to me. Don Genaro explained that I had found the place where he had been waiting because he had guided me with a sound he'd been making. As he voiced his words, I realized that I had indeed been hearing a peculiar sound I thought to be a buzzing in my ears. It had seemed to be more of an internal affair, a bodily condition, a feeling of sound so undetermined that it was beyond the realm of conscious assessment and interpretation. I believed that Don Genaro had a small instrument in his left hand. From where I sat, I could not distinguish it clearly. It looked like a Jew's harp. With it, he produced a soft, eerie sound which was practically indiscernible. He kept on playing it for a moment, as if allowing me time to fully realize what he had just said. Then he showed me his left hand. There was nothing in it. He wasn't holding any instrument. It had appeared to me that he was playing some instrument because of the manner in which he had put his hand to his mouth. Actually, the sound was being produced with his lips and the edge of his left hand, between the thumb and index finger. I turned to Don Juan to explain to him that I had been fooled by Don Genaro's movements. He made a quick gesture and told me not to talk and to pay close attention to what Don Genaro was doing. I turned back to look at Don Genaro, but he was no longer there. I thought that he must have climbed down. I waited for a few moments for him to emerge from behind the bushes. The rock he had been standing on was a peculiar formation. It was more like a huge ledge on the side of a larger rock wall. I must have taken my eyes away from him for only a couple of seconds. If he had climbed up, I would have caught sight of him before he had reached the top of the rock wall, and if he had climbed down, he would also have been visible from where I was sitting. I asked Don Juan about Don Genaro's whereabouts. He replied that he still was standing on the rock ledge. As far as I could judge, there was no one there, but Don Juan maintained over and over again that Don Genaro was still standing on the rock. He didn't seem to be joking. His eyes were steady and fierce. He said in a cutting tone that my senses were not the proper avenue to appraise what Don Genaro was doing. He ordered me to shut off my internal dialogue. I struggled for a moment and began to close my eyes. Don Juan lurched at me and shook me by the shoulders. He whispered that I had to keep my view on the rock ledge. I had a sensation of drowsiness and heard Don Juan's words as if they were coming from far away. I automatically looked at the ledge. Don Genaro was there again. That did not interest me. I noticed semi-consciously that it was very difficult for me to breathe, but before I could have a thought about it, Don Genaro jumped to the ground. That act didn't catch my interest either. He came over to me and helped me stand up, holding me by the arm. Don Juan held my other arm. They propped me up between the two of them. Then it was only Don Genaro who was helping me walk. He whispered something in my ear that I couldn't understand, and suddenly I felt that he had pulled my body in some strange way. He grabbed me, in a manner of speaking, by the skin of my stomach and pulled me up to the ledge, or perhaps onto another rock. I knew that for an instant I was on a rock. I could have sworn that it was the rock ledge. The image was so fleeting, however, that I couldn't evaluate it in detail. Then I felt that something in me faltered, and I fell backwards. I had a faint feeling of anguish, or perhaps physical discomfort. The next